A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift waters 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners, 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. Beyond one of the sentinels, the landscape was empty. The railroad track ran straight into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless, there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle slope topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway up the slope between the bridge and fort stood a company of infantry soldiers, drawn up in the at-ease position, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against their right shoulders, their hands crossed upon the stocks. To the rear of the line, a lieutenant stood, his sword thrust into the ground, and his hands resting upon the hilt. Excepting the group of 4 at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels, facing the banks of the stream, might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silently observing the work of his subordinates, making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are signs of deep reverence. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good: a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long, dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray, and had a kindly expression which one would scarcely have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently, this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the 2 private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart 1 pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing on the 2 ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the crossed eyes of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood, almost but not quite, reached a 4th. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the captain, the sergeant would step aside, the plank would tilt, and the condemned man would go down between the ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He now took a last look at his precarious footing, and then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move. What a sluggish stream. He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mist under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, the piece of drift, all had distracted him. And now he became conscious of a new disturbance. A sharp, distinct, metallic percussion like the stroke of a blacksmith hammer upon an anvil seemed to ring out. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurably distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each stroke with impatience, and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. He opened his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. As these thoughts, which we hear set down in words, flashed into the doomed man's brain, or rather, crystallized into a coherent hope, the captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. A slave owner and, like many of his class, a secessionist, he was ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Circumstances which he could not control, and which it is unnecessary to relate here, had prevented him from entering the ranks of the valiant army that had fought the disastrous campaigns ending with the fall of Corinth. He was forced to endure a life of inglorious inaction, chafing under the strain and longing for the opportunity to distinguish himself as a soldier. He believed that such an opportunity would come, as it comes to all in wartime. Meanwhile, he did what he could. No service was too humble for him to perform in aid of the South, no adventure too perilous for him to undertake, provided it was consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier, and who in good faith and without too much qualification assented to the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. One evening, while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic bench near the entrance to his grounds, a gray-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. While she was gone to fetch the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired eagerly for news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," said the man, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the other side. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged. I saw the order myself. How far is it to the Owl Creek Bridge?" Farquhar asked. "About 30 miles. Is there a force on this side of the creek?" "Only a picket post half a mile out, on the railroad, and a single sentinel at this end of the bridge. Suppose a man, a civilian and a student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel," said Farquhar, smiling. "What could he accomplish?" The soldier reflected. "I was there a month ago," he replied. "I observed that the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is now dry and would burn like tinder. The lady had now brought the water, which the soldier drank. He thanked her ceremoniously, bowed to her husband, and rode away. An hour later, after nightfall, he repassed the plantation, going northward in the direction from which he had come. He was a Federal scout. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From this state he was awakened, ages later, it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. They seemed like streams of pulsating fire heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but a feeling of fullness, of congestion. These thoughts were purely physical, having no relation to his conscious mind. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power only to feel, and feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion, encompassed in a luminous cloud, of which he was now merely the fiery heart. Without material substance, he swung through unthinkable arcs of oscillation, like a vast pendulum. Then all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud plash. A frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken and he had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him and kept the water from his lungs. To be hanged and drowned, he thought, that is not so bad, but I do not wish to be shot by them. No conscious volition prompted the act, but from the sharp pain in his wrists he knew that he was trying to free his hands. He began to observe his own efforts with a detached curiosity, as one might watch the performance of a clever conjurer. What marvelous dexterity! What astounding, almost supernatural strength! Ah, splendid! Bravo! The rope fell away. His hands parted and rose to the surface, dimly visible in the growing light. With ever-increasing attention, he watched as first one hand, then the other, seized the noose about his neck. They tore it away and flung it from him with violence. "Put it back! Put it back!" He thought he shouted these words to his hands, for the agony that followed the rope's removal surpassed all he had yet endured. His neck burned with intolerable pain. His head seemed on fire. His heart, which had been barely fluttering, leaped into his throat, straining to burst free. His whole body was convulsed with excruciating spasms, but his rebellious hands heeded no command. They beat the water with powerful, rhythmic strokes, driving him upward. He felt his head break the surface. Sunlight blinded his eyes. His chest expanded convulsively, and at the peak of his suffering, his lungs filled to capacity with air. He was now in full possession of his senses. More than that, they were preternaturally acute and receptive. The terrible shock his system had endured had so intensified and refined them that they recorded impressions previously beyond his perception. He felt the ripples against his face and could distinguish the separate sound of each small wave. He gazed at the wooded bank, saw each individual tree, every leaf and the veining of each leaf, down to the insects among the foliage. The locusts, the flies with their glistening backs, the gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He discerned every color of the rainbow in the dewdrops upon countless blades of grass. The humming of gnats dancing above the eddies, the flutter of dragonflies' wings, the strokes of a water beetle's legs, like oars propelling a tiny boat, all combined into a distinct melody. A fish slid past his face, and he heard the sound of its body parting the water. He came to the surface with his back to the bridge. In that same instant, the visible world seemed to rotate slowly around him, as about a pivot, and he saw the bridge, the fort on the slope, the captain, the sergeant, the two soldiers, his executioners. Their figures stood out sharply against the blue sky. They were shouting and gesturing, pointing at him. The captain had drawn his pistol, but did not fire. The others were unarmed. Suddenly, he heard the sharp crack of a shot, and something struck the water forcefully a few inches from his head, spraying his face. Another report sounded, and he saw one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder, a wisp of gray, smoke rising from the muzzle. The man in the water saw the eye of the man on the bridge gazing at him through the rifle's sight. He noted that the eye was gray, and recalled that gray eyes were reputed to be the sharpest, that all famous marksmen had them. This one, however, had missed. A countercurrent seized Farquhar and turned him face once more toward the wooded shore. Behind him a clear, ringing voice rang out, its tone even and sonorous, cutting across the water with such distinctness that it pierced and dominated all other sounds, even the murmur of the stream in his ears. Though no soldier, Farquhar had spent enough time in army camps to recognize the grim meaning of that deliberately measured, drawn-out cadence. The company commander, drawn up on the bank, had taken charge. How cold and inexorable it was, delivered with a passionless modulation designed to instill calm in the men, the merciless words spoken with calculated clarity. Company, attention, shoulder arms, ready, aim, fire. Farquhar dove, plunging as deep as he could. The water roared in his ears like the cataract of Niagara, yet he still heard the muffled thunder of the volley. As he surfaced again, he saw glittering pieces of metal, strangely flattened, which, swaying gently, sank slowly to the bottom. Some touched his face and hands before floating away to continue their descent. When he came up, gasping for air, he realized he had been submerged a long time. The current had carried him a considerable distance away from the danger zone. The soldiers were finishing reloading their rifles. The steel ramrods, withdrawn from the barrels, flashed simultaneously in the sun, described an arc in the air, and disappeared back into their channels. Meanwhile, the two sentinels fired again on their own initiative, and again to no effect. The fugitive saw it all, looking back over his shoulder. He was now swimming confidently with the current. His mind worked with the same energy as his arms and legs. His thoughts moved with the speed of lightning. The lieutenant, he reasoned, made a mistake by acting according to the book. He won't repeat it. Dodging a volley is as easy as dodging a single bullet. No doubt he has already given the order to fire at will. This is bad. It's impossible to evade them all. And then, 2 yards from him, came a monstrous splash, followed immediately by a deafening, swift roar. The sound seemed to fade gradually, as if rushing back through the air toward the fort, and culminated finally in a thunderous explosion that shook the river to its very bed. A wall of water rose up, loomed over him, crashed down upon him, blinding and choking him. The cannon had entered the fray. As he shook himself free from the vortex of churned foam, he heard the buzz of a stray cannonball overhead, and a moment later came the crack of splintering branches from the woods. They won't try that again, Farquhar grasped. Next, they'll use grape shot. I must watch the gun. The smoke will warn me. The sound lags, you see. It trails the shot. And it's a fine piece of artillery, that cannon. Suddenly he felt himself spinning, whirling like a top. The water, both banks, the forest, the bridge now behind him, the fort, the soldiers all blurred and swam before his eyes. Objects announced themselves only by their colors. A furious whirl of horizontal, motley stripes was all he could see. He had been caught in a whirlpool and was being spun and carried toward the shore with such violence that he felt dizzy and nauseated. A few moments later, he was flung onto the gravel of the left, the southern bank, behind a small projection that hid him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion, the abrasion on his arm where it had scraped against a stone, brought him back to his senses. Weeping with joy, he dug his fingers into the sand, scooped up handfuls, and showered it over himself, blessing it aloud. The coarse grains glittered like diamonds, rubies, emeralds. They resembled every beautiful thing on earth. The trees upon the bank appeared as giant garden plants. He noted the precise arrangement of their ranks, inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A mysterious, rosy light filtered between the trunks, and the wind rustling in the leaves sounded like the strains of a golden harp. The whistle and crack of canister shot in the treetops above his head interrupted his reverie. The frustrated gunner had sent a random farewell greeting. He sprang to his feet, scrambled up the gentle slope, and vanished into the thick undergrowth. All that day he traveled, guiding his direction by the sun. The forest seemed boundless. Nowhere was there a clearing to be seen, not even a game trail. He had never suspected he lived in such remote wilderness. By day's end, he was faint with fatigue and hunger. Yet the thought of his wife and children drove him onward. At last, he came upon a road and felt with certainty it would lead him home. It was as wide and straight as a city boulevard, but appeared utterly unused. There were no bordering fields, no structures of any kind, not the slightest sign of human habitation. Not once did a dog bark. The massive, dark trunks of trees formed a solid wall on either side, converging to a single point on the horizon like lines in a perspective drawing. Looking up from his corridor through the forest canopy, he saw large, golden stars overhead. They formed strange, unfamiliar constellations. He felt there was a secret and ominous meaning in their arrangement. The surrounding woods were full of peculiar sounds, and among them, once, twice, and again, he distinctly heard a whisper in an unknown tongue. His neck ached intolerably, and touching it, he found it horribly swollen. He knew a dark ring, the rope's burn, was clearly visible upon it. His eyes seemed starting from their sockets. He could no longer close the lids. His tongue was swollen with thirst. To soothe the burning, he thrust it into the cool air. How soft was the grass growing on this untraveled road! He could scarcely feel it beneath his bare feet. Evidently, despite his suffering, he had fallen asleep while walking, for now he saw a new scene. Perhaps he had merely recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own home. All is as he left it, and all is bright and bathed in the radiant morning sun. He must have traveled all night. He pushes open the gate and walks up the wide avenue. He sees a flutter of feminine attire. His wife, looking fresh, cool, and sweet, steps down from the veranda to meet him. At the bottom of the steps, she stands waiting, with a smile of ineffable joy, an attitude of matchless grace and dignity. Ah, how beautiful she is! He springs forward with extended arms. As he is about to clasp her, he feels a stunning blow upon the back of his neck. A blinding white light blazes all about him, with a sound like the shock of a cannon. Then all is darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I'll be happy to chat with you.